I was thinking this thing should be titled Painters on Painting, but then uh, there's so many different ways to think about what we're about to talk about. What painters read, what painters have said, etc. I remember, though, one of the first things I did when I was visiting R.H. Ives Gammell, who I subsequently studied with for the first time, was I asked him for a reading list. And he said, "You're the first person. Would you believe you're the first person that's ever asked me for a reading list?" Well, in some ways, it might have been surprising because I'd been told by a previous teacher that you don't read books, you just look at pictures. But do painters read, and what ought they to read, et cetera, et cetera? It's pretty big deal. Let's have a chat about it for a second. But before I do, thank you, Lauren K., for that continuing support. Linda Jen, the same. Ilya, that's a nice size contribution. Thank you so much for that one. And Ernie, thank you, Paul. Been watching you for years and can't express how much I appreciate all your wisdom that has done so much for me in my work. A donation from me is long overdue, and I'll continue to do so as long as I'm able. Bernie. Thank you, Bernie. Nice to have you aboard. I know that's true of a lot of us. I don't do that. I mean, I sometimes enjoy different things online, and it doesn't even occur to me to make an offer of support. And people like in my situation, I'm not taking money from it, but the guy doing the editing really does need some support. Sort of continuing. We've been trying to, our numbers and subscribers and stuff at YouTube. It's a pretty high number, but it's surprising how little you get out of that. Any advertising they might do. And I don't want to apologize for the advertising because it certainly can help defray. All right. So let's read Caleb's query. Dear Mr. Ingbretson, I'm 19 years old and I'm writing to you from Brazil with great respect and admiration for your work as an artist and teacher. I'm a complete beginner in the field of painting, not a painter myself, but I have a strong interest in learning more about art, especially painting and the analysis of artworks. I was wondering if you could kindly recommend any books or writing suitable for someone just starting out, particularly those that focus on the fundamentals of painting and how to understand and analyze works of art. I would be very grateful for any guidance or suggestions you could offer. Thank you for your time, and I hope this message finds you well. Warm regards, Caleb. Caleb, thank you for that. I was laughing sort of in the middle of that because when you said, but I have a strong interest in learning more about art, especially painting and the analysis of artworks. One of the great difficulties in painting for painters, is having critics who have never studied painting do that work of criticizing, or historians and all those things. Their interpretations of things are so weird and so off the mark so frequently that I would, if you actually plan to be that sort of like a scholar regarding painting, I really recommend you still put in 3 years or so in an atelier. Really do that kind of work. Don't underestimate how much more valuable you'll be to the world around you when you're speaking about painting if you've done something like that, if you have your hands in a little bit. I'm going to talk about, in fact, I could just mention, there's a guy, this one called Masters of Past Time. Fromentin was a writer, and he writes this critique of Dutch painting, but he became a painter. And so he's writing this critique as a really good writer. Gammell believes he was the best writer per se of anybody who's written on painting, but he had the background. He had studied painting, and his body of work is pretty intriguing, actually, in the sort of somewhat of a Delacroix direction and of Orientalist work. So you can look him up at some point. I left a line on the bottom there, so that's the line where you can find this book, a PDF of this book online. I found this one of the most fascinating reads when I first started out. But I'm going to share with you, and I've done a little bit of this before, but I'm going to share with you some points regarding what to read and why to read it and all that sort of stuff. But the main thing is to read painters on painting. Painters are the experts. They don't say a huge amount, but when they say something, it's got way more weight, way more rightness about it than if, say, a Paul Valery talking about Degas says something about Degas. In fact, Degas told him that he was always off the mark. What is that expression you'll never understand? So always, so I'm offering this not so much to you as a person who's wanting to be a scholar, even though I'm doing that, as much as this is the body of, anybody wants to understand painting, and including if painters want to be better painters, you need to listen. You need to have read. You need to be conversant with the writing and quotations, the reliable quotations, direct from the painter's, mouth or pen. So that's Masters of Past Time. But the one I jumped over, the classic point of view, is where probably, apart from Leonardo and Reynolds' discourses, this probably was the most important book. Well, and I should back off one more point, because I'd already read Gammell's Twilight of Painting. Twilight of Painting might have been the first book I read about painting. I suspect it was. And and then I think I immediately after that went to possibly the classic point of view. And that's a reprint. This one here, this version of it is a reprint, and I think you can still get that for like $20 or some odd number. But I also just include the line underneath that shows you where you can read it online at this place, at this archive.org. And there are a lot of sites like that. I think Gutenberg Press, others. Some of them make you jump through hoops a little bit, which is pretty annoying. But on the other hand, they're doing the work of getting the book out there. Some of the books I'm going to be talking about you will find at studio.ingbretson.com. So be sure at studio.ingbretson.com. Be sure you check there. The volume we have, the treatise on painting by Leonardo, there is just, in my view, it's as nice a version of it and as accessible, meaning you can copy and paste from it and other things, as any of the Leonardo works, versions of that Leonardo work. So let's just jump right into this little idea of what Gammell had to say. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to try this, Mr. Producer. Bear with me. I hope we can do this together. I'm going to try to pull it up just because I've got it down below on the screen below. I'm just going to try to pull it up. If things go well, I'll be doing the right thing here. So this is what I'm going to do. I've reviewed this before, but not this way. So this is Gammell's essay called Books on Painting. This is what he handed me when I asked him what to read. He said, I've got this. I don't, nobody's ever asked me for this before. But he wrote a book review. And, Gammell was just piling up. Even before I talk about what he says in this book review, this is just one of the very wonderful values that Gammell brought. But Gammell was just piling up better and better and better content from a painter's point of view about painting as he went through his life. I don't know when he first wrote. I don't even know when he wrote this one, but he had it in hand when I saw him. But he was writing all the way through till his last days, probably. This is the Shop Talk of Edgar Degas. This is obviously a must-read. Gammell sort of annotates the quotes from Degas. Keep remembering, by the way, that what happened to me was when I began to do this, I began to just filter. I would just read and read and read. Sometimes I would read books like Walter Pock on Ang. Let's see if that's here. This one here. And there's a lot in this book that is Walter Pock telling you stuff. But this had a whole nice selection of really good quotes. And so you can read other books like this, books by non-painters, but you're looking for the quotes. You're looking for that. The painters read of other painters, or the painters themselves conversing about their art or their general opinions about the arts and what that all is about, what that's all about. So this here, Books on Painting. The interesting thing is Gammell in this book, he comes up with this first one. It's called Artists on Art. And I remember seeing that and being totally disappointed. I went and found that book. In fact, I may have already read that. That might have been a book in hand, sort of at the Art Students League. Because, we're all finding the latest writing on that. But this book has so many useless quotes. And so Gammell starts his book reviews by telling you there's a couple good things in here. Most of it's not going to do you a darn bit of good. Keep remembering that the one thing you're going to do if you're going to read quotes of painters, pick painters that you really highly admire. Gammell's model is borrow from millionaires. So you're not looking for the quotes of people you think nothing of. And it's your obligation to yourself, Be respectful of yourself, your views, your opinions, your sense of things. Find out what the writers who did work you think great, great value. Find out what they said. Just can't say that too often. But so he goes into this thing, like the writings of Kenyon Cox. And what you're going to find, if you read nothing else but the first paragraph of these things here, I'm trying to blow it way up. Here, I never have any hesitation in recommending to a student the 5 books by Kenyon Cox as the best possible general introduction to the study of European painting as understood by a painter. How about that for a good place to start, Caleb? I've read these volumes and by the way, I don't disagree with Gammell. I've read these volumes many times at different stages of my working life, and that's another big deal. So when you do read again. And subsequently, after you've learned more, especially if you take 2 or 3 years and study painting. But I've read these volumes many times at different stages of my working life, and I've never failed to be impressed by the author's analysis of his subjects and by his ability to express his ideas in a way which should be comprehensible to the layman as to the painter. And so on. By the way, let me as well read this part. Although his own work as a painter is uninteresting for the most part, and occasionally even offensive in taste, it's competent, learned, and intelligent, and it gives ample evidence of Cox's intellectual and technical understanding of several types of painting. Now how about that for a start, just to start talking about, just for us to talk about Kenyon Cox. But look what he does with, let's just say Reynolds. I've talked about the notebooks of Leonardo and Reynolds as well. Let's go over to Italian cities. Let's look at that introduction, because this might surprise you, and it certainly, I wasn't inclined to read a book called Italian Cities with Blatchfield having toured Europe. But he says these essays on the great decorations of the Italian Renaissance constitute the best writing on the subject which I've read. That's a statement and a half, isn't it? On the great decorations of the Italian Renaissance, which is a significant body of their work is the great decorations. The beginner will read these volumes to increase his general knowledge of painting, but when and if he's confronted with specific mural problems of his own, he'll find Blatchfield's analysis extremely valuable. Now, how's that? It's interesting. He immediately or quickly here mentions modern French painters. You see that there. The Prado and its masterpieces. The numbers of these books by painters, they're all by painters. So what I'm going to do, let's see if there's one or two more I should just visit just for a second. Oh, the journal. Let's see what he says about the journal of Delacroix, because we've just been talking about that. Let's just blow that one up if we can a little bit. Here, the diary of a gifted artist is interesting for the light it throws on the dramatic personality of this author, as well as for its picture of the Parisian intellectual world in his time. While a mature artist may possibly profit by studying Delacroix's ideas on painting, they can only confuse and mislead a student insufficiently grounded in his art to recognize and discount the irrational character of this. Well, you see where he's going with. But do you see what I mean? This is a plot. This is a legitimate book review. And now you're having a painter talk about another painter. By the way, we all have angles on we have our preferences. So you might find that with Gammell included, he will not give as much regard to a Millet or Michelangelo as he does to a Leonardo or a Nang, right? It's just going to be the way it'll be. Predilections, painterly culture that you're raised in, any of those things. But he talks about his emotionally toned thinking. And he says, this very irrationality is doubtless responsible for the reference in which the journal is nowadays held in certain quarters. In other words, some people like it just because of that. But the fact is that Delacroix's critical faculty was conspicuously poor, and his approach to it. So you see what I'm doing? He's doing this. So he's giving you reviews of books, but there is value here. And I can assure you of that, having just reread it myself. in the last days. So here he's talking about the Delacluze book on David. All you guys who are chasing down the classical are going to want to read that. And you who are in that inclination, Caleb, to understand. But then he brings up the Velasquez. Oh, here's Modern French Masters. Then he brings up Velasquez by Stevenson, we talk about all the time, and Jan Vermeer of Delft. So here you are. Let's read that. Let's bring that up and read it. The Stevenson. In a sense, this book is an exposition of Impressionist principles, which takes Velasquez as the supreme example of Impressionist painting. Read from that angle, it's one of the most valuable books on painting in existence. Okay? The author, a pupil of Carolus Duran, did not continue painting. I've never heard that he achieved any sort of distinction in that field, but the book shows that he acquired a very clear understanding of the nature of Impressionist painting as it was understood by the men practicing in the latter part of the century. So there's that one, and then Hale's book is also referred to, and I've shared this with you before. This review of books is available either online at studio.ingbretson.com or ask me for it, okay? And that would be by writing to me, Ingbretson _ studio at yahoo.com. Okay. Here, Delft, Jan Vermeer of Delft by Hale. This book is not only a penetrating analysis of the art of Vermeer, but it's equally remarkable as a study of the entire Impressionist approach to painting. Now, do you see what he's saying? This is a painter. Well, now he's going to say it, a painter's book about a painter's painter. A painter's book about a painter's painter. That's Vermeer. Probably nothing hitherto published contains so complete a presentation of the working outlook of painters at the turn of the 19th century and during the years immediately following. Or as much studio lore, another word for shop talk. It cannot fail to remain an invaluable source of information about what is now a nearly lost form of art. And he tells you, secondly, to read the earlier editions of it, not the first version. It was redone after he died, and good stuff was lost. Collier's book on the art of portrait painting. You see what we got here. So I highly recommend you read this as your starting point, Caleb. It's a very good one. Look up Gammell's work to see if you can at least see enough plausibility in it that it would commend his work should commend his writing to you. Are his skill levels significant enough? And Gammell's were. I don't think anybody in his generation knew as much as he did, or was as skillful in as many different ways as he was. The guys before him, but wonder what else I should talk about there. So what I'm going to do, I think, and end this or continue with this, I'm just going to go ahead and share with you my reading list, which is also in this part of the page. And I'll just talk about some of the things I'm recommending in general about reading, how to read, et cetera, however you want to think about that. So this is my, what I call the Ingbretson Studio recommended reading list. This is by no means definitive, just as Gammell says in his review. But but I've divided this in any case. The books you might want to read at level 1, level 2, level 3. They become more and more, as it were, arcane or involved in complexities. But you can see in the first place here, I name in the level 1, I just named 5 books by Gammell. Gammell's idea was that the closer the person is to your generation, the teacher is to your generation, the more you can get from him. In other words, the more distant, the harder it is to really know what he meant. Even meanings of words change. And so, these aren't in any particular order. Clausen, I think they're alphabetical, yeah. Clausen's up there. There is a volume, 16 lectures on painting. Clausen sounds a lot like me when I talk. But I put him up there. The one guy I don't think, on here is Hunt, the American. What's his first name? But Hunt has a book that called Talks on Art. That it really is a good volume. It should be on the first probably the first wave, but certainly the second wave of books you'd want to read if you really would want to get on board. But there you see the classic point of view. Leonardo's on painting, that comes in so many different versions. As I said, ours is probably as good as any, the one online, if you don't mind online stuff. And I mentioned Walter Pach. Reynolds' Discourses is way up there. The first couple books I read once I was with Gammell were the Leonardo's. And I don't think Leonardo's is something you can bypass. You have to look at that right away. Key things happen in there, at least regarding most prominently regarding the nature of light on an object. It isn't that we as Impressionists are painting with that as a, formulaically or anything like that, but being aware of that and actually knowing how to draw and model and all those things that relate to those things is a big deal. It's something you need to have worked on. But there are other ththings as well. Lots of lighting, standing back the proper distance from what you're painting. Just a lot of stuff that's just pure basics. He had a tendency to think stuff through, and he becomes a model of thinking through. If you didn't have one in your life, notice the things. Now, I don't agree with all he says. We've learned things since then, and all painters, all the guys in all sorts of history, it's like in the sciences, nothing's settled. It's a very useful way to think about the sciences. But, and then in that last one, the impressions on painting, that might have been put somewhere else, but it's sort of a little bit of common sense anecdotes. Alfred Stevens, but he was a Belgian painter who was apparently the chief painting influence per se, the management of paint kind of influence on Degas. Now, but in the second level, you'll find Julia Cartwright's book on Millet. That book is just like the book I just mentioned by Walter Pach on Ang. She's just really selected great quotes. I've read I think I've read all the collections of Millet's statements, and she's got the best ones. I mean, it was very impressive that she did that. She was, Julia Cartwright, I believe, isn't a painter, by the way, so I'm reading these books because of the value of their quotes, what the painters had to say about painting. But she clearly had she was very insightful. She wrote bios of a lot of different people. I think kings and things like prince, queens, whatever, people in high positions. Okay, but you've all probably read into John Sargent's book on Charteris. What you may not have read about, and I'd show you where does that show up? Is that way in the fourth row? But there is a book on Rothenstein that has lots of statements. Rothenstein is he's a painter, but he's sort of almost like a gadabout. He seems like he just knew everybody. He was helping his friends. He was right there in the milieu of all the painting in London. And of course, the connection between London and Paris was, it was pretty well overlapped. And, but his book has a lot of stuff also about Sargent, maybe as much as the Charteris book does. And I say that again, don't read what people say Sargent did, except you can listen to people like students of painting who are sitting there listening, watching his demonstrations and said what they observed. But Collier's book, so there's the portrait painting book that Gammell recommends. But then you see these 4 other books by Cox, Kenyon Cox. You will never regret reading any of these books. They're so insightful, so useful. So there's that first part. These are the books that I consider the ones that benefited me the most, and would benefit somebody just getting introduced through this generation and the immediate preceding one, which was Gammell. Boy, better help my throat a little bit. So. That's that group. Now, Anson Cross has a book called Light and Shade and a different one called Drawing and Painting Self-Taught. I don't generally fancy books that tell you how to paint anywhere near as much as I value this whole conversation about painters. You've got to be painting, though. You need to be painting. And any way in you can get in is going to be better than no way in, probably. But you need information. And some of but if It is what it is, right? It just you really have a difficult time really getting into painting without somebody standing somewhere near you. It's such a huge value. But Anson Cross has one called Drawing and Painting Self-Taught and Light and Shade. They're both full of just basics. I think Light and Shade, maybe a section called Charcoal Drawing, which is just virtually everything I've ever heard about charcoal drawing. It shows up in that book. Anson Cross was a teacher, a normal school teacher in the Boston area, and he was highly recommended by like 70 different painters of the time, including Sargent. His book was recommended. I think it might have been this one in particular. There's a testimonial at the back listing all these guys and what they said. But again, Gammell, a couple more of Gammell's books, just read all of his stuff. I mean, I would suggest you just read all Gammell's stuff and get your head around it. I don't think you should read it with the idea of becoming a little Gammellite. I mean, that's poison to me. You read Cox, read Gammell, you'll even see how Gammell comes out of Cox significantly. We all come from somewhere. But read the guys, and the guys nearest to us, Stevenson and Hale, that's the generation immediately preceding. But read what Gammell said about Paxton. I think we finally put that up on our website. If we haven't, somebody should let me know. The Paxton by Gammell is a very, very, very useful read. And then there was all these other ones. And there's Hunt, Talks on Art right there. So Will Lowe, these are all painters studied in France, Americans. Sensier was the other collection of Malay's letters. But Stevenson's Rayburn, Stevenson on Rubens, Whistler's books. Pointer, I don't know how that got down there. Pointer did a book on painting, and there are several books on oil painting that are actually good, sort of cover the territory in general about oil painting. I think someone, by the way, possibly by name, I'll see if they come up. But I do recommend that you, but you can see how this is a little bit tertiary. 10 o'clock does give and Gammell's got a review of that, so you can look at that for yourself in his volume. I won't say any more about it, but I don't disagree with what he's saying. But these are all in that class of things with some value, if a little bit more limited, or things you wouldn't have already run into other places. This one called Modern French Masters, it's edited by John C. Van Dyke, but it's I thought I had a volume here. I don't think I do. I do have one, not here. That's a book that has a number of really good essays. I think one on Julian, Bastien Lepage. And I think they're all written by other painters, because I think that's true. And again, I think Gammell reviews it. He probably tells us that. So you can look up his essay. So let's go to the next page. And, so here we go. This is the finish of that. And I call these reference books, but you can see these are some of the how-to books. Hatton on figure drawing and composition. Some people include Loomis and people like that. I don't. You read too many of these how-to books, it can do more to confuse you than anything else. On the other hand, there's a body of data that's common to all of them. So one of the things I found out when you're reading books on perspective is read like 5 of them before you don't just read one and try to believe in it, but scan closely 5 of them, and you'll start seeing the agreed upon points. I find those to be significantly the most valuable one. One of the things that comes up in talking about anatomy, for example, is just the idea of salient points, like where bones show. These are some things that make the creation of the figure more accessible to you. So things like that will come up repeatedly with different writers on anatomy. So you can see I have stuff, Dow on composition. I should have Cyril Pierce. Yeah, there he is on composition. These are all in the class, though, of stuff that's more in what you think of as the practical application. Carlson on landscape painting. But there's a lot of stuff in some of these guys' books that I don't do and probably wonder about. Burge Harrison, does that show up in here? Yeah, there it is, landscape painting. He's got this concept of dither nicely expressed in that book. Darner, materials and artists, they're used in painting, but so there's Solomon, and Harold Speed, the practice and science of drawing. But Parkhurst, the painter in oil. There's a surprising amount of information in that. That's really solid stuff. But that's all. This is all. Most of the stuff I'm calling references in that very practical, down to earth side of it. And as you can see, most of these guys are one level or another are artists. I think all of them are that have written these books. Cole Vicat, I'm not sure about whether he was. I think he was a painter as well. Madame Cave, drawing from memory, she's a painter. We have Lecoq there, training of the memory in art. But yeah, I think you've seen it. You've probably seen all these, the practice of oil painting, all that stuff. I've never got, I mean, studying with Gammell as I was, and whatever else it was, I read these books, but there wasn't a ton of stuff that I needed. There wasn't, and I'm not sure that I would have, in fact, we didn't precisely follow their practices, and I've in some instances showed you the difference. They're a little bit more planar and a few other things like that, more outline based. Nothing about it is problematical. The problem of form in painting and sculpture is a very interesting one by Hildebrand. And Charles Blanc was a good painter, grammar of painting and engraving. Some of these are fairly boring. They are more useful as, the materials, for example, of, is that in here? Materials and methods. There's a really good German writer, well, Derner, yeah. And then subsequently an American, what's his name? Everybody probably knows in this country anyway, materials of the artist. So then there's history. And again, if you can find painters, this one about the 19th century, these two Rothenstein books, Men and Memories and Since 50, those are really good. But you can see that most of these guys, now Blatchfield's artist on art is pretty low on that, but most of these, painters, Ricketts a painter, John Rewald's not a painter. And I don't know what really Jackman is, but this is the most important book in America on the American arts. It's got everybody who's anybody from way back, including all the way up to the arts of pottery, but with pictures. So really useful stuff. This, again, I'm suggesting to you, Caleb, that you read history from a painter's point of view first. Just saying. So a person like Vasari, who is a painter, is going to be more useful to you than, that is, say, I would suggest to you that there's going to be a lot more unity to the entire understanding of painting when you take that approach to it. But you think what you like and work with how you want to. I had a cross-discipline thing. I'm a big fan of cross-disciplines. As I said before, all the stuff I've told you before about what might be useful isn't definitive. Max Meldrum, I don't even have him on my list. I would highly recommend you read Max Meldrum's stuff. And one of his students, I think, a book called See It Painted or something like that. I don't know who, I've never been able to find that book, by the way, but based on their work, I would suggest you might, on the how-to, I would put it in that pile of guys there in the reference pile, minimally. They take different approaches, but Meldrum refers to his as a science, as well, of painting. So, but the other ones, cross-disciplines, the poetic diction was recommended by C.S. Lewis, and I do recommend you read C.S. Lewis because he's a good thinker and he helps you to think, and I like the way not just the way he thinks, but the things he thinks about. You can read, Kant, Goethe, Schilling. You can read who's Burke. There are painters, Aristotle. Painters, there's no reason not to read philosophy. But don't confuse it. And some of these guys have really profound understandings, without any question at all, about the nature of this form, and really give you insights into even how we want to think about this as a form. So I would never underrate that, and I don't have much of that here, if anything. I don't know if I have anything. I don't. But this one, Applied Imagination, is one that will enable you to think a little better. And there's a number of books by Rudolf Flesch, how to think. Or, The Art of Clear Thinking, I think is what it's called. Numbers of books by Rudolf Flesch. If you're young and you want to be developing your thinking skills, that's in that class. So there's numbers of others I could list here. I'm not taking the time to do it, not so much because it's not close to your question, but Owen Barfield, Poetic Diction, Study and Meaning. I mean, like really, really, really a cool book. I mean, really, really something that is, you'd say in one sense, college material. It's really helpful. And again, that's classic in that thinking. Talent is overrated. There's other books out now. This guy wasn't the originator of, if I understand it, of that body of thinking. I recommend you read Suzuki's book called Nurtured by Love. He says, give me a mediocre talent in 10 years and I'll give you a genius. And he's like us in one sense in that he teaches music from sound. And everybody does in one sense, but there's a lot of sight reading that a lot of people are made to do. Read the notes, play the note, and he's actually trying to get you to go around until you can play, and just play until you can play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star as a little 4-year-old or whatever on the violin. It's a philosophy that's a lot more like the visual philosophy that the Impressionists like myself have. Somebody offered me that book and says, this sounds like the way everything you say. And it was quite true, including some interesting other issues. But talent is overrated. The Poe on the philosophy of composition, you can read composition from other angles. Why not read a composition from other angles? Writing angles, I'm trying to say. So he's talking about poetry, actually. Oscar Wilde, The Decay of Lying, this is some fun stuff. The idea that we are painting the truth, there's something about the new realism or the Trump realism, we try to fool the eye, kind of complete truth, and I can really make this more like anybody else as a form, it's one of those things. And I think there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek in several people, including Degas, who says it's all lies with the accent of truth. There's something very important about understanding painting that comes with reading a thing or two like this, that we are not making life. This isn't actual, So John Gardner on Becoming a Novelist, that's sort of in the class of, how tough it is, may wind up being for you to become a painter. He says that the novelist, John Gardner, my daughter has had dinner a couple times, I think, with his son. But he said in his book on becoming a novelist that you need to, the ideal thing for you to do, which some painter could say the same thing, is to find some beautiful rich woman, or vice versa, if you're some rich guy who just loves everything you do and will support you. So you can focus on your painting work. There are music things like that, but it's good to read though, sort of the practical side of somebody could have written on becoming a painter. I'm not sure what really useful books there are out there. So, but that's basically what I have to offer you. This is so limited. There's so much more stuff. I've read books on movies and photography and other places as well. Cross-reading is really a useful thing to do, so don't underestimate that. The argument is sort of be well read. But I'm saying be well read, but if you're trying to understand painting, listen to painters. It's like me talking to you about science. It's not going to be very useful to you. And a writer, a scholar, I don't care how much time they spend around painters, they're not going to have the it that it requires to be right on. And it can be very misleading. One of the most misleading things I've found, and I'll end with this, is people writing about painters and everything they say about them is genius, brilliant, and all that stuff. And that sort of takes you out of the game. You know what I mean? That's a big, big, big mistake. The novelists on Titian and Michelangelo and others, Agony and the Ecstasy, that stuff is just stuff on Rembrandt. It's just like, it is not helpful. Nobody out there needs to be thought of as a genius. Think of that 10 years of a mediocre talent in 10 years, and I'll give you a genius. Think of it differently, but painters do think of it differently. The practical side of it is a big deal. Alfred Steven's Impressions on Painting is a good one, just to introduce yourself to that more down-to-earth kind of thing. Painters sometimes are hard to understand. Their words are, well, one student of mine referred to my phrases, my shop talk, aphorisms and things like that, dicta, as riddles. I've said that before. They are kind of riddles. And then, so what the big deal is about all this stuff is you need to work it out. And there's such a thing as reading too much. You need to work. And when you sense a dearth of information, read. But don't stop working to read. But what's going to happen is you're going to read, and all of a sudden you're going to feel like you're choking, and you can't be painting from words. You're going to get back to work, back to work. And all the words you put into yourself, I found, get worked out. They get worked in. Okay. All right. That's what I have to say, Caleb. I hope this is useful to some people. So, again, I want to thank our wonderful, if I can get back to, if I can get it back here, to our wonderful contributors this week. And to Caleb, for your question, I really appreciate that. But Lauren K., Linda Jen, Ilya F., and Bernie, the new Bernie, with your kind comment. Thank you guys very much. Thank you everybody for keeping on the support. It's so crucial, and this is now a couple of months in a row where it's on a level where it's a couple of weeks in a row, where it's a level where it's really, truly, sustaining. So if you can keep it coming, and you guys who haven't yet and you're inclined to, I just sound like one of those radio preachers. I'm so sorry. But it is significant if you want more. It's just significant. Who knows when Mr. Producer decides that we're not worth his time anymore. I'm praying he won't, and he initiated this project on your behalf, so a little counter support would be sweet. Okay, here I am doing that. But anyway, in the meantime, of course, again, thank you for subscribing, sharing especially, and liking, all those things. Do them online as much as you can. And let's get there. I don't know if we're at 18,000 yet or not. I'll have to ask Mr. Producer. All right. And for those of you who are going to London, I'm looking forward to seeing you in London for the workshop just in a week or two. And we're almost out of here. I better hurry up and get ready. All right. Take care. Have a wonderful week.